Buon pomeriggio a tutte e a tutti con Mondadori Education. Siamo ad un nuovo appuntamento con la letteratura inglese e di nuovo con grande piacere, con il professor Arturo Cattaneo, che credo presto vedremo. Eccoci qua. Ciao Arturo, buon pomeriggio.
Ciao Laura, buongiorno a tutti.
Poco bisogno di introduzione, ma lo rifacciamo volentieri. Il professor Cattaneo è per noi autore di una nuova letteratura, peraltro, dal titolo New Literary Journeys, ma è autore per noi, appunto, chiacchieravamo prima di questo intervento, di a questo punto un gran numero di titoli sulla letteratura inglese ed americana, oltre appunto ad essere docente presso l'Università Cattolica. Prima di lasciargli la parola e di annunciare di che cosa parleremo oggi, con piacere vi faccio sapere che è in uscita, anzi credo sia uscito un suo titolo per Einaudi Saggi su Shakespeare, quindi Shakespeare in Hollywood, con l'aiuto di Gianluca Fumagalli, ed è un viaggio lungo un secolo tra cinema e teatro, mi sembra Europa e America, e mito e cultura popolare. È un bellissimo libro per chi volesse curiosare. Più tardi diamo un link mentre il professore parla e invece ci racconta del tema di oggi, che ha invece a che fare con mother tongue e anche in particolare in dettaglio con English as a second language for Joyce and writers from the former colonies, e appunto questo tema grande come il mondo ormai sul che cosa si intende per mother tongue e come questo second language veniva sentito da molti degli autori più importanti della storia della letteratura. Gli lascio presto la parola. Ormai, come è nostra abitudine, raccogliamo le vostre domande che potete scrivere direttamente in chat mentre il professor Cattaneo parla. Alla fine ci riserviamo appunto invece uno spazio piccolo o meno piccolo per domande, curiosità o interventi che avrete voglia di fare, e quindi insomma cercheremo di dare risposta a tutto ciò che il webinar del professor Cattaneo suscita in voi. Le domande si inseriscono in chat. L'attestato di partecipazione è disponibile nei prossimi giorni sul sito, che è mondadorieducation.it. Dovrete cercare la pagina attestati e troverete tanto l'attestato quanto le slide che abbiamo usato nel corso di questa diretta. Per chi vedrà l'evento in differita, l'attestato sarà disponibile, ma dovrete aver fatto l'accesso dalla mail di conferma entro la mezzanotte di oggi, e la registrazione resterà disponibile sul nostro canale YouTube a questo stesso indirizzo. Se vorrete essere informati circa la programmazione delle altre nostre dirette, potete ugualmente iscrivervi al nostro canale YouTube, tasto iscriviti che si trova poi in basso, e poi sulla campanella che comparirà a fianco. Credo di aver dato lettura di tutte le istruzioni che servono per stare con noi, e lascio la parola al professor Cattaneo e riprendo appunto al termine del suo intervento per raccogliere le domande che nel mentre arriveranno. Quindi, prego.
Grazie Laura per l'introduzione, come sempre esauriente e gentile, molto gentile nei miei confronti. Spero mi sentiate bene, perché purtroppo ho un abbassamento di voce, insomma quelli che una volta si chiamavano mali di stagione, ecco. Oggi siamo qui per parlare di qualche cosa con cui siamo a conoscenza tutti. Come diceva Laura, è it's a matter today for everyone all over the world. And the title is Mother Tongue with a question mark. English as a second language for Joyce and writers from the former colonies. Now, the abstract of this webinar, begins with these words: for millions of people. Actually, I should have written for hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. English is a second language. And this is true not just of ordinary people, including our students, and that's quite relevant for us, obviously, but for a surprising number of writers whom we study and who are considered masters of the English language. Of course, in the case of these writers, the statement must not be taken literally, not quite literally, but yet it's quite interesting. It goes without saying that we have many studies at our disposal on English as a second language, linguistic studies, quite clearly, to which we may refer. But today we want to see the point from the perspective of writers and English-speaking writers at that. To put it simply, quite simply, even native speakers or mother tongue speakers who have a superior knowledge of the language may sometimes have problems of sorts with English. And this sheds an interesting light on the subtle relation between language, environment, and communication processes, something which relates to all of us, including and especially our students. I will divide my talk in 4 parts. First one being called Putting the Case, because to my knowledge, the first writer, the first important writer to put the case clearly was James Joyce in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1916. And that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we decided to include that work, that novel by Joyce, and this particular passage in our new anthology, the one which Laura was mentioning. Put in the case. Why put in the case? Because there's one very interesting passage in this novel, which is about a young man, Stephen Dedalus, at school. Another point of great interest, I believe, for our students. This is, again, possibly the first important work to give us a student in high school, which is exactly, the situation in which our students are placed. And there, in this particular passage, we see Stephen going to meet or see one of his teachers, the Dean of Studies, so an old Englishman, one of his teachers. And he goes into the place, into the classroom of the theater, in fact. Good morning, sir, can I help you? The teacher happens to be there trying to light a fire. And to light a fire, he wants to pour some oil into the fire. And teacher says, if you can read it there is an art in lighting a fire. Not too much coals, said the dean. The feeding is a nice problem. We must choose the pure oil, and you must be careful when you pour it in, not to overflow it, not to pour in more than the funnel can hold. Now, mind you, the words highlighted in bold are mine, in the sense that I have highlighted them. Joyce doesn't, or didn't. And the reason I highlighted them is because they are the central words to go to the problem of a second language. What funnel, asked Stephen. The funnel through which you pour the oil into the lamp. That, said Stephen, is that called a funnel? Is it not a tundish? So we have 2 words here, funnel and tundish. And the dean says, or asks, what is a tundish? That, the funnel. Is that called a tundish in Ireland? Asked the dean. I never heard the word in my life. Notice how much stress, Joyce lays on that, on the 2 specific words and on the very word. I never heard the word in my life. And Stephen says, well, that's how we call it in Ireland. A tundish, said the dean reflectively. That is a most interesting word. I must look that word up. Upon my word, I must. The rhetorical repetition of word is quite clear. And it's quite interesting and very telling for us to see how this hesitation of the dean about the word starts some thinking, serious thinking about language, about his own language, in Stephen Dedalus. He thought, first of all, he thinks, reflects that the man to whom he was speaking, was a countryman of Ben Jonson. And he thought, the language in which we are speaking is his before it's mine, because it's English. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master on his lips and on mine. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted his words. And then he goes on more lyrically, my soul frets in the shadow of his language. But the important thing is that Stephen Dedalus, the young Irishman, Joyce's other self, alter ego, has this precise feeling that the words the English teacher uses are his, the teacher's, before they are Stephen's. Why? Because English is an imposed language. And we know how much Joyce cared about that question, the issue of language. Which brings us to the process of translation, the second point of our talk. Translation. Now, we know that translating from one's native language into English when one speaks or writes is what one shouldn't do, as is well known, in the sense that ideally we should think, speak, and write in English. It is, however, in a way unnatural, must be admitted, or very difficult at the beginning. And once again, the thought goes to our students. We should sympathize with them. And we want to see now a particular case. In the footsteps of Joyce, other Irish writers have explored the feeling of speaking a language which is not exactly one's own, in the sense that is being imposed by a colonizing power. And translation is a word which is borrowed from a very interesting play, which many of you will know already, but is good, going over it again, I believe, by Brian Friel, called exactly Translation, which came out in 1980. Now, the play is set in 1833 in a rural village in Ireland, County Donegal, northwest corner of Ireland. And it, according to the Norton Anthology, it dramatizes two key processes in the linguistic transformation of the colonized nation: remapping and education. Now, remapping is meant in a literal way, as we're going to see. So mapping out the countryside and the physical side of Ireland. Why? Because following the first Ordnance Survey of Ireland, ordered by British Parliament in 1824, each Gaelic name was to be replaced either by a translator's English equivalent. For instance, in the play, Knocknaree becomes King's Head, because that's what it means in Gaelic, or with a similar English sound. So they dreamed up, and I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, but anyway, it becomes something like Dromduff, Dromduff. That's the kind of process that went on in Ireland in the 19th century, especially in the first half, but also in the second half. And always, according to the Norton Anthology, language is crucial in claiming the land for the British Crown. And again, in a very literal way, in a very practical way. Why? Because it rids it, the land, of ambiguity and opacity. In other words, the land now can be read literally. You know where places are, what their names are. Before, they couldn't, because the Gaelic names were incomprehensible to the British. So that the land becomes readable, knowable, taxable. Taxes could be imposed, very important, militarily penetrable, evacuating its linguistically embodied history and memory. Now, as we can imagine, there was resistance to the change in Ireland, especially in the local Irish schools, the so-called hedgerow schools, where the English language and its literary canon, Wordsworth, for instance, were unknown. In fact, Greek and Latin authors, ancient Greek and Latin authors, were taught in preference to English ones. So in these schools, there was a great resistance to the change, to the new names, which means to the new language, because according to law, it was forbidden to speak Gaelic in public places, including schools. So people had to forgo their native language, which was Gaelic, and to use English instead. It was a great change, and there was great resistance to that, as we may guess. But also, in the play, this is shown quite well, realistic acceptance of historical facts. The schoolmaster, who at the beginning is very contrary to changing names and dropping one's native language, and understandably so, in the end says, we must learn where we live. We must learn to make the new English names our own. We must make them our new home. Of course, that might have come, with hindsight, since Brian Frail was writing more than a century after the change in names and in language in Ireland. But even so, this poses the issues, the two main issues at stake here. They may be summarized as this, going to the third part of our talk today. In the presence of an imposed language, we are faced with two alternatives: acceptance or refusal of the language. This is quite interesting because that's exactly what happens to some people. Learning a language, as we know, is a psychological process as well as a practical one. And how many times we see students who refuse the language deep down inside, because they don't say so, but it's quite clear that they refuse maybe school at large, but surely the language, because we're dealing with the English language in our case. Other people accept it with joy. They embrace the new language. So this is quite relevant. It's not just matter of writers, obviously, but studying these writers may be quite useful, may give us insight into a broader psychological attitude. Now, we're going to see a few case studies. Now, I must say that some of them are admittedly more difficult than others. The first one we saw, Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, is fairly easy for a number of reasons. The others we're going to see are more difficult, and that depends on the class we are facing. But let's proceed with order. Acceptance. We have on this side Salman Rushdie, the great Indian writer, who famously says and writes, "English is an Indian literary language." In his essay, "Commonwealth Literature Does Not Exist," notice that Commonwealth literature is in inverted commas. Rushdie exemplifies the partial acceptance of the legacy imposed by English on India and to the world. He writes, "English literature has its Indian branch, so it's not Indian that has been imposed English, or not quite so, or not altogether so. By this I mean the literature of the English language. This literature is also Indian literature." This is acceptance, but also in a way taking over the language which has been imposed. There is no incompatibility here. If history creates complexities, let us not try to simplify them, which is to say, it's a fact, historical fact, that the British were in India, that they diffused the use of English, that they taught English, that in many ways English was an imposed language. So let us not simplify that, but it is also true that now English is also an Indian literary language. It belongs to India as well as to England. Now, that's a syndrome that's been called identify with Caliban or refusing Caliban. Caliban, of course, the references to Shakespeare, The Tempest, something about which we said a few words in some of our former webinars. According to the colonial linguistic experience. Here we see the words of another famous writer, the Nobel Prize Derek Walcott. In 1974, he wrote in The Muse of History, "Their admirable wish to honor the degraded ancestor limits their language to phonetic pain, the groan of suffering, the curse of revenge." Let's notice the wording is quite telling, isn't it? In other words, Walcott is saying some people, some new world poets who were born in the former colonies, they want to honor their ancestor. They want to say that colonization was a bad thing in many ways, but in doing so, they limit their poetic power and strength to the phonetic pain, the groan of suffering, the curse of revenge, and the three words are quite significant. The tone of the past becomes an unbearable burden. for they must abuse the master or hero in his own language. And this implies self-deceit. In other words, they are deceiving themselves because they curse the former colonial master in the same language which he has taught them. Their view of Caliban is one of the enraged pupil. They cannot separate the rage of Caliban from the beauty of his speech. When the speeches of Caliban are equal in their elemental power to those of his tutor. Caliban speaks as good in English as Prospero or all the other European characters in Shakespeare the Tempest. And the important sentence is the last one highlighted here. The language of the torturer mastered by the victim, which is a way of appropriating the language. So we see that Salman Rushdie and Derek Walcott are spokespersons for what we might call acceptance or partial acceptance. For other writers, such as George Lemming, another writer whom we saw in our previous talks, this is not true. He identifies with Caliban in an opposite way by accusing Prospero of making Caliban a slave and the English language the prison in which Caliban is enclosed. Prospero believes that Calibans can learn so much and no more. Caliban can go so far and no farther. Prospero lives in the absolute certainty that language, which is his gift to Caliban, is the very prison in which Caliban's achievements will be realized and restricted. Why restricted? Because he will never be as good as Prospero in speaking English in this case, or any other European language imposed by the colonial masters. Since his use of language is no more than his way of serving Prospero. And as I said, we said a few words about this, I believe, in our previous talks. Quite an interesting way of dealing with this, and it's a funny one as well. Again, this is fairly difficult because this writer, Louise Bennet, speaks in Jamaican language or Jamaica language, which is quite difficult to understand. And even, when written as here, this comes from Jamaica language, a radio monologue. It's not so easy. But I've tried that in class. And I must say that it's surprising because if you have a good class, obviously it works because they try to translate the Jamaica language into proper English, something about which we'll go back later on. But sometimes, I started with classes which were not so good. They're quite restless, they hardly listen at times. But this was a great challenge to them. They seemed to like it. Why? Because it was sort of a joke play. Anyway, let's see what Louise Bennet says in this radio monologue. And by the way, it's still on YouTube. I listened to it the other day again, and it's very entertaining. And I hope it's still there, in case somebody wanted to have a look at that. Now, the way I read it, obviously, is no real Jamaica language, so I apologize for that, but that's the only way I can read it. My auntie Rochi said that it boiled her temper and really vexed her for true anytime she heard anybody style with Jamaican dialect as a corruption of the English language. What's the meaning? My aunt Rochi, this imaginary character, is really very angry, loses her temper, when people talk of Jamaican dialect or language as a corruption of the English language. Notice how corruption of the English language is given in good English. For her aunt replies, if that be the case, then should I call English language corruption of Norman French and Latin, and let alone tatter that language, when then say that English is derived from. Ooh, you hear the word derived. English is a derivation, but Jamaica dialect is corruption. What an unfairity. And if you listen to the radio monologue, when she reads out the last two lines, the audience, burst out laughing. Because the point here is that how come that's what, Louise Bennet is saying, how come that Jamaica is a corruption of the English language. But why then is not English a corruption of Norman French and Latin, from which it obviously derives? So we use derive for English, but corruption for Jamaica, Jamaican dialect. What an unfairity. That's unfair. Again, if possible, let's listen to this. But even read is quite telling, I believe. Next one. Again, very briefly, appropriating the master's language. And again, Louise Bennet in Jamaica language. Why do we see this as well? Because here, Louise Bennet says that by speaking a language which was barely intelligible, understandable to the colonial masters, the people in Jamaica could have their own feelings and thoughts for themselves. In other words, their masters could not understand them. As we can read in the last part, this. Let me see. Oh, no, let's start from the very beginning. But we African ancestors them pop we English before father them. Yes, pop them and disguise up the language for project for them African language in such a way that we English for father them still couldn't understand that we African ancestors them was a talk about. They could not understand what our African ancestors talked about. And if we go to the last sentence, and no so English talking Smaddy can understand when we itself, we don't want them to understand, we are say. And so we can still speak our Jamaican dialect when we don't want to be understood by the English. Ending with oh. Again, radio monologue. Appropriating the master language, and in British Caribbean, we are to the fourth part of our talk today. The role of education comes in quite strongly. Of course, this links with our second point, translations. What happened in Ireland also happened all around the British Empire. The British wanted or needed to educate people in English. Why? Well, first of all, for them to be able to be servant or to participate in the colonial machine. But especially after the abolition of slavery, when education became a necessity and colonial schools were funded. Now, in the case of the Caribbeans, but also throughout the world, they had these so-called royal readers, which were primary school books, first printed in 1877, but used in the Caribbean until the 1950s, which is quite close to us, isn't it? Now, the problem of education in English, in an imposed language, posed several, again, problems to English-speaking writers born in the Caribbean, for instance, but elsewhere in the empire. Why? It wasn't just a linguistic problem, which was a good point, actually, because as in Ireland, people were dispossessed of their mother tongue, something about which we'll soon revert. This is a short excerpt from History of the Voice by the West Indian writer Kamal Brathwaite. And in History of the Voice, he writes, in terms of what we write, our perceptual models, we are more conscious, for instance, of the falling of snow than of the force of the hurricanes which take place every year. The falling of snow, why? Because the British models are all there for the falling of the snow, because there are countless English poems or prose passages, for that matter, which deal with the falling of the snow. Whereas there's not one single poem in the canon, in the usual canon of English literature, which tells of the hurricane. Why? Because that doesn't happen in England or in Britain. In other words, we haven't got the syllables, the syllabic intelligence to describe the hurricane, which is our own experience, whereas it can describe the imported alien experience of the snowfall. So this poses psychological, we might say, problems as well as linguistic ones. Quite interesting. And Brathwaite goes on to speak about the submergence, the highlighted word, of the imported language. Why? Because following the conquest and the colonization of the West Indies, but also the rest of the world, by the conquering people, whether they spoke Spanish, English, French, Dutch, didn't really matter. They insisted that the language of public discourse and conversation, of obedience, command, and conception should be English, French, Spanish, or Dutch. They did not wish to hear people speaking Ashanti or any one of the Congolese languages or African languages. They did not wish. It was something more than that. We're going to see that right away. But let's concentrate on what Brathwaite writes. So there was a submergence of this imported language. Its status became one of inferiority. Similarly, its speakers were slaves. And the next thing we're going to see is a poem of a sort, quite a complex poem, and fairly difficult, but of great visual also impact. It's a pity, we cannot have it here as it's printed, as it is printed visually. The slides just couldn't hold it. But if you see it, it's really, really impressive. And if when our students see it, it's really impressive. It's Discourse on the Logic of Language by West Indian writer Marlene Norbis Phillips, who's now a Canadian citizen. And title is She Tries Her Tongue, The Silence Softly Breaks. A very original and powerful reflection on the concept of nation language, that is, language imposed by the colonizers and change adopted by the colonized. This is a witty, sharp, and moving poem in which the writer experiments with typography, wordplay, different voices and discourses. Now, to make it simpler, I sketched this out. The poem is made up of 4 levels. First one is a poem proper, divided into several stanzas. We're going to see them right now. Then we have a prose-like account of an African mother giving birth to a child, not in a clinic, not in a hospital, but by herself, or in a village, or in open nature. And so cleaning it with her tongue. It's a newborn child. It's got to be cleaned, and she has no way of cleaning it except with her tongue. Again, the idea of tongue, mother tongue, this is literally a mother tongue, talking to her son or daughter, her child, in a very passionate, powerful way, not with words yet, which the child could not understood, but with her own tongue, literally cleaning the child. Then we'll see 2 edicts from local times, forbidding plantation slaves from using their mother tongue. And then a section in prose reporting the opinions of 2 learned scientists of the 19th century about the brain, that part of the brain which supervised the use of language. But it's clearer, maybe, I hope, if we see the 4 parts of the poem. Now, this is the proper part. It's quite clear that this is written in a language which is not received pronunciation, proper English or standard English simply, and which is also very peculiar to the writer. English is my mother tongue. A mother tongue is not a foreign lang. The difficulty of pronouncing the word language, which then become anguish, suffering, a foreign anguish, because the language is foreign. It's not the language that my mothers and fathers spoke. English is my father tongue. A father tongue is a foreign language. Therefore, English is a foreign language, not a mother tongue. What is my mother tongue, my mammy tongue, my mummy tongue, my momsy tongue, my mother tongue, my mat tongue? I have no mother tongue, no mother tongue, no tongue to mother tongue me. Again, this should be heard, and there are very good recordings, especially those which have been recorded by the writer, by the author herself, Nobis Philip. I must therefore be tongue, dumb tongue, dub tongue, dumb tongue. But I have a dumb tongue dumb, father tongue, and English is my mother tongue, is my father tongue. Again, is a foreign language, anguish. A foreign anguish is English, another tongue, my mother. My mother, mammy, mummy, mother, mother. Other languages as well, apart from English. Tongue, mother tongue. Tongue me, mother me, touch me with the tongue of your language. Anguish, English is a foreign English. Now, I confess I did not want to read it all. I thought it was too long, but I was so caught by it every time I look at it. And our student too might be caught by that, in my experience at least. So this is the proper part. This is the poem proper. Then we have the description, the prose part. When he was born, the mother held her newborn child close. She began then to lick it all over, to clean it. The child whimpered a little, but as the mother's tongue moved faster and stronger over its body, it grew silent, the mother turning. The mother then put her fingers into her child's mouth, gently forcing it open. So again, this is about a mother's love to a newborn baby, and it's got a lot to do with tongue and mouth, which are the two instruments of speech. Talking about which, the poem by Nobis Phillips then talks about two famous doctors, Wernicke and Broca, respectively, 19th century scientists. Dr. Broca believed the size of the brain determined intelligence. He devoted much of his time to proving that white males of the Caucasian race had larger brains than and were therefore superior to women, blacks, and other peoples of color. So we see how the problem of language, the issue of language, is related also in this poem and in other poems too, or in other writings too, to the idea of the supremacy of the white people or white nations. Last part is more technical. This is really frightening, but it's true. It comes from real historical documents. And this is the part which is also contained in, this part is also contained in Nobis Phillips' poem. Edict 1. Every owner of slaves shall, wherever possible, ensure that his slaves belong to as many ethno-linguistic groups as possible. In other words, they speak as many languages as possible. Why? Because if they cannot speak to each other, they cannot then foment rebellion and revolution, which meant splitting families and putting aside friends, people from the same tribe, so that slavery was twice painful and suffering. You were also isolated from people who spoke your own language. And Edict 2, every slave caught speaking his native language should be severely punished. How? Where necessary, removal of the tongue is recommended. Notice, removal of the tongue is a periphrase for cutting off his or her tongue, is recommended. Not only that, the offending organ, the tongue, when removed, cut off, should be hung on high in a central place so that all may see and tremble. Well, that says volumes, doesn't it, about what an imposed language can be and what taken out or taken away one's native language can mean to people. But to finish this talk, maybe on a lighter note, and something which is closer to our own experience, and to that of some of our students, or most of our students. Let's see another poem by an English writer, Tony Harrison, a very good writer, one of the best writers in modern English literature, which is called Them and Us. Now, the us is the north of England pronunciation for us. So the poem is written by the very white, very British, very English Tony Harrison, is about them and us. Who are them? There's a division quite clearly from the title. Them are people of the establishment. Them are people who use standard English or the BBC English or the King's English or the so-called received pronunciation. And us are the people from Northern England or Cockneys, any people belonging to the lower classes who use a different kind of English. They don't say us, they say us. And the poem begins with Demosthenes, one of the most famous orators in ancient Greece. He was a stutterer by nature, and he put pebbles in his mouth in order to correct his pronunciation. And the ancient Greek word I literally means a. They're a lament, because poor Demosthenes, went to great extent and to great trouble to learn to speak properly. And that applies to Tony Harrison. He was born in a low-class family, and they did not speak King's English or BBC English. They said us instead of us. They did not use to pronounce the H before the word. And in fact, when at school, but he was an intelligent, a bright boy, Tony Harrison, so he won a scholarship to a public school in which, as we know, Eton, Rugby, for instance, Harrow, the public schools, those who lead up to Cambridge and Oxford. And in those schools, you are taught proper English, received pronunciation. So when Tony Harrison, as a young boy, would start My Heart Aches, which is the beginning of John Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, a very famous poem, which is taught at school, which we still can find in our anthologies. My heart aches. He pronounced it me heart aches, dropping the H, my becomes me, and the teacher stops him. My heart is broken, you barbarian, TW. He was nicely spoken, and the teacher says, can't have our glorious heritage done to death. You are murdering the English poets with your pronunciation, with your low-class pronunciation. And then they go on to talk about poetry being the speech of kings, but you're one of those. Shakespeare gives the comic bits to prose. And poor Tony Harrison replies, but teacher says, all poetry, you see, is being dubbed by us into RP, received pronunciation. Received pronunciation, please believe us. Your speech is in the hands of the receivers. Now you're here in a public school, you will be changed, like as children in the Irish schools or in the West Indian schools were. Your speech, which is the same as you, is in the hands of the receivers. A sentence a very powerful phrase, very powerful sentence, which somehow reminds me of George Orwell's 1984, Big Brother, the speech, new language, is in the hands of the receivers. We say us, not us, TW, and that shut my trap. I shut up. I doffed my flat A's, as in flat cap, my mouth all stuffed with glotters, great lumps to hawk up and spit out. Enunciate. Notice the fine Latin words. But in the second part of the poem, we have Tony Harrison's rebellion. Even though he went to public school, he went up to university, he learned Latin and Greek, and when he became a writer, he wanted to use his native language as well. So not the received pronunciation, not the King's English, but also the kind of English that he spoke at home, the kind of English that millions of people spoke and still speak in their English home. And the second part opens with an exclamation, a defiant exclamation. So write, you buggers, then. We'll occupy your lousy leasehold poetry in my own way. I chewed up literature. Notice the way literature is written, and spat the bones into the lap of dozing Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones, the author of the famous Dictionary on Pronunciation. Dropped the initials I'd been harried as, and used my name and own voice, ooze, and the sentences with by, with, from, which one shouldn't do according to certain rules, and spoke the language that I spoke at home. Rip, R-P, rip, receive pronunciation, rip, TW. TW, because even though his name is Tony, and he styles himself Tony, and they call himself Tony at home, and his friends call him Tony, as we know, it's quite useful, for upper class people in England to use the initials TW, for instance. I'm Tony Harrison, no longer you, not TW. And you can tell the receivers where to go and not aspirated. They can go to hell or, without the H, to L. Once you know Wordsworth, matter, water are full rhymes. Ooze can be loving as well as funny. Tony Harrison maintains that writers like John Keats, who was a Cockney, spoke the local London dialect, or Wordsworth, who came from Northern England, pronounced in a different way from the received pronunciation. So for Wordsworth, matter, water were full rhymes. But the poem ends quite jokingly. It's a wink at us reader. My first mention in the Times automatically made Tony Anthony. But the first time the Times mentioned me as a writer, they didn't write Tony, they wrote Anthony. So that was their way to say, you are one of us now. What is the morale? We don't know. There's no way of escaping the establishment. I don't know. But I thought, this was quite a good poem in itself, first of all, but also something to show us and our students, especially, that not just we, not just they, have had problems with the language which is not their own. It can happen to an English-born writer like Tony Harrison. And that's, all I had to say for today. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie Arturo, un bel tema, bello spesso. Mentre parlavi mi si accendevano possibilità di lavoro in classe rispetto alle quali appunto le insegnanti e gli insegnanti che sono collegati credo potranno poi assolutamente aprire e ampliare, però insomma c'è un bellissimo lavoro che si può fare secondo me di debate e di preparazione. Ci sono dei filoni di storia della lingua che forse a partire da un tema come questo possono poi chiarificare o spiegare meglio che cos'è pidgin, che cos'è creolo, che cos'è standard English, che cos'è RP pronunciation. Si può aprire a quello che è global English, no? Che è tutto un altro tema molto grande rispetto al quale appunto, ecco, tutto quello che è una lingua non più identitaria per nascita, ma una lingua invece di uso può invece significare. E mi ha molto toccato poi appunto uno dei tuoi ultimi commenti, appunto, there's no way in escaping the establishment. Chissà se c'è invece, e se sì, legato a quali aspetti. Ecco, è global English un modo, secondo te?
Può essere, sì, ovviamente l'establishment assume vari aspetti, è metamorfico, per cui l'establishment oggi non è più l'establishment dei tempi in cui Tony Harrison cominciava a studiare. Abbiamo visto, è nato nel 1937, quindi parliamo dei secondi anni 40, c'era ancora l'impero, l'Inghilterra si illudeva ancora, la Gran Bretagna, chiedo scusa, o Regno Unito, di essere una potenza mondiale. E, quindi era anche un altro periodo. Oggi l'establishment è diverso, ha più aspetti più commerciali, Però il problema della lingua è sentito molto evidentemente perché da un lato c'è questo strapotere dell'inglese che alcune nazioni, alcune culture cercano di controllare in modo molto forte. E si può capire anche come sia um, come anche a livello inconscio ci sia da parte nostra, dei nostri studenti, probabilmente una difficoltà di conciliare i due aspetti. Per esempio, una cosa che colpisce in classe, ma molti l'avranno provato, quando si legge una poesia in inglese, un brano, o si parla in inglese, si usano parole che sono già usate nell'inglese, in italiano, termini inglesi che arrivano in italiano. E quando si chiede allo studente cosa vuol dire questo, niente. Proprio l'altro giorno leggevo una poesia di Thomas White, mi sembra, in classe. A un certo punto c'era l'aggettivo, la parola rave, R-A-V-E. Cosa vuol dire rave? Nessuno. Dico, beh, scusate, rave party? Ah sì, è vero. Quindi, cioè, a quel punto, quindi è una parola che era già stata assimilata in un certo contesto in italiano, però che non veniva collegata all'inglese. Queste sono tante cose su cui si può riflettere, o modi in cui si può lavorare con i nostri studenti, ecco, forse.
Senti, ti faccio una domanda appunto sugli americani. Allora, c'è una domanda e ci viene chiesto questo. In your overview of the uneasiness about using English as an imposed language, you did not mention American writers. Is it because they didn't feel that as a problem? Come la vedi?
Well, that's a good question, because of course, Americans, when they became a republic, way back, in 1777, later on, 76, later on, originally they did not have the problem of the language because in the 13 colonies, most people spoke English. Most people were of English descent. So apparently they did not have that problem. But the moment, the 13 colonies became the United States of America, they wanted to distance themselves from England, from Britain, for that matter, and from the English language as well. In fact, the Webster Dictionary, which is the first American dictionary, which came out between the end of the 17th and beginning of the 19th century, in various phases, was a reply to the languages of the English done in England, to the dictionary, done in England, and claiming that they had the right, America had the bigger and the better right to the English language. So it was a war with England that began at that time, a linguistic war. And by the way, since you were kind enough to mention my book, Shakespeare in Hollywood, that took place with Shakespeare too. From the beginning, as soon as they became a republic, the Americans wanted to appropriate Shakespeare to make it their own. They said, well, he's more of an American than of an Englishman. Why? Because he is a man who comes from the lower classes. He's a self-made man, like we Americans are. And that was not said in jest. It was quite serious, quite serious. Then, of course, for many great American writers, like Hawthorne in the 19th century, there was, and later still, there was a problem of distancing themselves from the former mother, England or Great Britain. Then with the new arrivals, with people flocking to the United States from all over the world, the problem was different. They had writers who spoke Italian or Yiddish or German or Swede at home, but which were brought up in English. And so in their works, you may see both cultures and sometimes both languages. And then it's in the Jewish writers, for instance. So for them, it's a different problem, but the issue is still there. But they would have enlarged talk even more.
Grazie Arturo. Mentre parlavi appunto ci sono poi un po' di considerazioni, commenti eccetera appunto rispetto alla capacità o non immediata capacità degli studenti di ritornare all'italiano, dove un uso dell'inglese ormai è dato per scontato. Appunto c'è la professoressa Tosato che portava un altro esempio, ci dice per esempio ho chiesto però il significato di draft animal e non riuscivano ad allontanarsi dal significato di schizzo, bozzetto, brutta copia eccetera, per cui c'è lavoro da fare sia di storia della lingua sia forse appunto di appunto considerazioni su come si muove, perché si muove, in che direzione si muove. Detto questo appunto la lingua è una cosa che ha moltissimo a che fare con tantissimi aspetti identitari, no? Ecco, qualcuno commenta politics often goes into the language ed è assolutamente vero, quindi insomma è come sempre un bel tema. Ti ringraziamo, a gripping topic come qualcuno ha scritto e quindi insomma ti ringraziamo molto e potrebbe essere un filone intorno al quale continuare a ragionare, questo appunto degli aspetti di come la lingua diventa identità, di come diventa cultura, quindi potrebbe essere una bella piega da prendere. Ecco, appunto.
Posso aggiungere solo brevissimamente, proprio anche perché uno dei problemi almeno che io ho trovato, ma parlando anche con tanti colleghi, è di non allontanare troppo la letteratura dalla lingua, non nel senso ovvio per cui usa la lingua, ma proprio perché far capire agli studenti che lavorare sul testo letterario vuol dire imparare più lingua e più facilmente rispetto, è una lingua che è tuttora usata, basta fare 2 o 3 spostamenti e lo si vede, in qualche caso neppure. È importante per dare l'idea della motivazione, perché lo studente a 16, 17, 18 anni, insomma, ci vogliono motivazioni un po' forti. L'aspetto culturale da solo non basta, almeno io ho trovato per mia esperienza che non bastava. Basta per noi di una certa età, insomma, ma non parlo per me ovviamente, non per chi ci ascolta, che so essere molto, molto più giovani.
Senti, ti ringraziamo come sempre, ti ritroveremo ancora
Grazie
più
a voi.
avanti, intorno alla primavera, non ricordo la data esatta, ma ricordo a tutti che invece ci sono sul sito a disposizione le date dei prossimi eventi. Ti ringraziamo moltissimo.
Grazie molto a voi, è sempre un piacere e un saluto a tutti quelli, a tutte quelle, a tutte e tutti che non vedo. A presto, arrivederci.
Arrivederci a tutti, buona serata.
Ciao, ciao.